Good evening, everyone. I think we're going to make a start, although there are some people still coming to join us. Very good to see you all. If this is your first webinar with us, you're very welcome. This is the 10th in our series, so you can look back at the ones and catch up on YouTube. We've got another 32 to go, so we're nearly at the quarter point of our work through Shakespeare's complete works via the Oxford World's Classics edition. Tonight, we're going to be talking about Romeo and Juliet, and I want to start, as I always start, by explaining that these editions build on the work of the New Oxford Shakespeare, a brilliant piece of scholarship coordinated by Gary Taylor, John Jowett, Terry Boras, and Gabriel Egan. And in particular, on this play, Francis X. Connor, who edited the play for that series. And what we have done for the World's Classics is to lift that work out of the big academic volumes, which we really urge you back to if you've got more questions, and to present it for modern readers with a new introduction. And that's been one of the great joys for me as general editor, is to pick people who I myself would like to hear from on these plays. And when I came to think about who I wanted, Hannah August was up on my list right at the top, because you can see that she had her pick of all the plays. And in fact, she picked Romeo and Juliet, slightly to my surprise at the time, but I'm absolutely delighted that she did. It's a wonderful, lively, bright, knowledgeable introduction. And it already answers one of the, I think, slightly tongue-in-cheek questions that we've had in the Q&A, which is there anything new to say? We're not all about novelty. We're also about, what do other people say and what has been said before. That's all worth doing. But it's great to be here together this evening and see what we can say about this play. So just a little word of housekeeping before we start. Do put questions if you have them in the Q&A. In the Q&A, I'll keep an eye on that. It's helpful to us if they can come in sort of throughout the session, so that we're not trying to get through them all at the end. We'll leave about 20 minutes for those questions. And so how this works is that Hannah and I will chat about the play, and in particular about her introduction, for the next 50 or so minutes. We'll cover quite a lot of the bases, I hope, of things that you might want to take further in the questions, and then we'll look forward to hearing what you might want to ask or contribute at the end. We've got an hour and a quarter, just under, now for this evening. Hannah, that's a long throat clearing without even saying hello to you. Thank you so much for being here. Where are you? Where are you joining us from?
Hi, Emma. Hi, everyone. I'm joining you from Wellington, New Zealand. It's a lovely sunny morning here, but my brain is still cranking into gear. So do be kind to me if I have any moments of brain fog. I've just had my first cup of coffee. It's just gone 7 a.m., but I'm delighted to be here.
Fantastic. I'm so grateful to you for being here. It's absolutely brilliant. And I don't know where everybody is joining us from, but I know from some of the conversations we've had in the past that we've got quite a global audience too for the live webinar, and more people following up. Great. So let's get started. So, okay, maybe we could just ask, why did you pick Romeo and Juliet? What can you even remember why that was the play that spoke to you when I contacted you about this all those years ago?
Okay, to be honest, Emma, you'd picked Macbeth and somebody else had picked Measure for Measure, and so the two that I
Okay, I picked
would have
Macbeth, which
opted
was
for.
exactly the editor's privilege to pick the one. Yeah.
Exactly,
Okay, so
exactly.
it was actually your third choice. Yeah.
Yeah, but I think I've been teaching Romeo and Juliet for a few years now, and actually, I've developed a much deeper appreciation for it as a play. I think we know Romeo and Juliet, and I think we know what it's about, and I think we know what the language is. But actually, there's more to what I've developed a greater appreciation for is the way that Shakespeare in this play is using language to set up the kind of formal structure of the play, particularly to aid characterization. I think that's become clearer and clearer to me the more time I've spent with it. And also the way that we get serves this idea of Romeo and Juliet as being, the greatest love story, a play for all time. Actually, the other thing that I think is clever about the play is the way that Shakespeare is taking very historically bounded ideas of love and both sort of building on them in the way that he presents Romeo and Juliet's love story, but also undermining them. And so I think there's actually more to the play than we sometimes give it credit for.
That's a brilliant answer, actually, isn't it? Because sometimes we are trying to introduce plays that we think should be better known. And there's, plenty of those. I was just looking at next year's list and thinking, oh, Henry VI Part Two. I really can't wait, but I also can't wait. It may be a play that people feel less familiar with. But here we're doing something different, which is actually to perhaps all of us think maybe we don't know it as well as we should, or maybe we know an idea of it rather than the play itself, because it feels like a, a story that has been so retold or is so iconic, I suppose, to use an overused word, that we hardly can see it. We can hardly see it and then sort of experience it freshly.
Yeah, I think so. And I think one of the things to bear in mind is that often when we're encountering it in film adaptations or productions, we're seeing quite a truncated version
Mhm.
of the second quarto script, and there's more to it. And some of those bits that often get cut kind of make the play fuller and more complicated than we sometimes give it credit for. And
Mm.
so it's nice to spend time with the whole of the text as well as
Mm.
a reader rather than as an audience member.
Yeah, great reminder. I remember looking at the script of Baz Luhrmann's film, which is still one of my great favorites, but it's about a third, I think, maybe a quarter, maybe it's
I think it's
25%.
yeah, it's significantly short. I
Yeah,
think it might be two-thirds, but it's
yeah,
there's a large chunk of the text that is
yeah,
cut, and Raleigh did the same as well.
yeah,
Um, and so sitting with what is gone is
yeah.
interesting.
That's really great. That's really great. Okay, so what I know from these webinars in the past is that there are some people with extraordinary expertise on this call, and for which we are grateful, and sometimes that comes through, particularly in the questions. But there are also, and we completely are delighted to have them with us, people who don't feel they know very much yet and are keen to find out more. So sometimes we start, without assuming too much, and then move on. So I wonder if we could do that in that spirit and think about. Can you just tell us where does this come in Shakespeare's career? How would you contextualize it in the shape of other, the other things we might know or the other vantage points we might have on his writing?
Yeah, so it's interesting in terms of when it comes because actually it's one of Shakespeare's earliest tragedies. I think Titus is probably the only tragedy prior to this, and it's we think it was probably first written and performed around 1595, 1596. So it's an Elizabethan play, smack bang in the middle of the 1590s, which is the decade when Shakespeare is predominantly writing comedies. He's known for his histories still. He hasn't written those great tragedies of the early 17th century that we come to know him for as a tragedian. And so to produce Romeo and Juliet at this point as a tragedy, and we can talk about the extent to which it is or isn't tragic for most of the play, it's a bit of a departure from form for him. And it's another play set in Italy. That's the other thing, is that he's got all of these comedies that he's writing around this time that are Italian set. He's already had The Taming of the Shrew and I'm blanking
Two
on
gentlemen,
what
two
precedes.
gents.
Yeah, two gents, absolutely.
Yeah.
And then around exactly the same time as Romeo and Juliet, we've got Love's Labour's Lost, and very contemporaneously A Midsummer Night's Dream,
Mm.
with the story of Hermia and Lysander that looks at the outset quite similar to the story of Romeo and Juliet, but obviously that's a play that has a happy ending. And then he moves on to Merchant of Venice and Much Ado in the second part of that decade as well. So all of these Italian set comedies and this Italian set tragedy that barring perhaps the prologue, which tells us that it's going to have a tragic ending, looks quite similar to a comedy from the outset. And so it's worth thinking about what the audience's expectations going into this play in the 1590s might have been. They might not quite have known what they were getting in terms of thinking about other plays of Shakespeare's that they'd seen. And then the other thing to think about is also the fact that this is a play, and we can talk about it more, that's very inflected by the language of sonneteering. The sonnet vogue is is still in kind of full swing in the 1590s, and Shakespeare himself is writing many of his sonnets that then come to be published for the first time in 1609 around this time. And you can see that writing kind of coming in, that type of thinking and linguistic composition coming into Romeo and Juliet very clearly. So yeah, it's interesting to think about it as kind of presaging some of those later tragedies. I don't know whether it does particularly, and maybe it looks more similar to those comedies that are being written around the same time.
I love that sense of it looking similar to the comedies. That feels so interesting, even as a sort of point at the outset, when we're so used to thinking of this as a great tragedy, or sort of archetypal tragedy. So it's similar to the comedies. I get that in setting, in this Italian setting, and I suppose in the sense that it's not a soliloquizing singular play, is it, about one person, but it's more about a community and people getting together. Could you develop a bit what you were saying about Midsummer Night's Dream? I see what you mean about Hermia and Lysander, so a pair of lovers who don't have her father's blessing. Is that what you're thinking,
Yeah,
that they're similar?
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Who run away, sort of attempt to solemnize they're en route to solemnizing their marriage sort of secretly and clandestinely away from their community without the permission of their parents, in the same way that Romeo and Juliet do, but ultimately authority in the form of Theseus, the Duke of Athens, comes in to say, look, actually, let's get on board with this marriage, and it's both kind of permitted and celebrated at the end of the play. They get that sort of twist upwards, whereas Romeo and Juliet get the twist downwards, and it ends badly for them. That type of attempt to kind of form a union that is outside of the kind of permitted structures of their community. And I think, yeah, sorry, you go.
No, I was just going to say it is so interesting that Shakespeare's comedies are all about women who, for one reason or another, usually circumstantial reason, choose their own husbands in the absence of their parents. I mean, that's not the case immediately. I can think that's not the case in Merry Wives of Windsor, for instance, and it's not the case in other things. Um, but I suppose in a way that's a radical suggestion that young women should choose their own husbands. But it tends to be tempered by the fact that they choose entirely suitable husbands, usually who their fathers might have chosen. But this is the
Yeah.
opposite of that. Although there is a way Romeo is a completely suitable, sort of structurally and sort of in terms of the both alike in dignity, I suppose, that we learn at the beginning. Um,
Well, exactly. And when when he gate crashes the Capulet party and Tybalt says, hey, look, it's Romeo, what are we doing letting him be here? Juliet's father at that point says, oh, everything I've heard about Romeo is that he's a fine young gentleman. Let's just
mm,
let it be. And so he at that point is able to acknowledge presumably what the rest of society thinks about Romeo and set aside his kind of Capulet bias against him because he's a
mm,
Montague. And yeah, so were it not for the feud between the Montagues and the Capulets, he would look like a highly suitable husband for Juliet, I think.
mm, mm, mm. And so, does the story Shakespeare inherits of Romeo and Juliet, is that a comedy or a tragedy?
Well, it's got the same ending, obviously. I think so. Shakespeare's working with predominantly with a source text, which is a narrative poem from 1562 by Arthur Brooke called The Tragedy of Romeus and Juliet. And this it's written in English, but it's based on some earlier continental sources. This is a story that had been around for centuries, and Dante's writing about the kind of the warring Monticis and Capulettis in the 13th century, and so we've got kind of classic Shakespearean borrowing here in terms
Mm.
of the story of Romeo and Juliet. But in terms of the direct source, which is this poem by Brooke, it is Shakespeare basically manipulates it slightly. He absolutely telescopes the time frame in terms of the narrative events. Things take place over a couple of months in Brooke, whereas obviously we've got this very, very constricted kind of 4-day time span in Romeo and Juliet. As we get it from Shakespeare, Shakespeare expands some characters such as Mercutio. In terms of whether that is a tragedy, that particular source text, one thing that's interesting about it is there are very frequent references to Romeo and Juliet's fate being the fault of fortune or fate throughout that, despite the fact that at the start of it, Brooke provides a sort of epistle to the reader where he says, I've presented this to provide a kind of moral lesson to my readers. We're showing how bad behavior gets punished, and the point of writing this and publishing this is to deter people from behaving badly in the way that Romeo and Juliet and the nurse and the friar all do. You don't actually get much of a sense of that in the poem that Brooke then presents aside from the epistle, but it's framed in that way. But certainly the idea of fortune and fate being a dictator of their fate, that probably aligns it more closely with some ideas of tragedy. That doesn't come through so strongly in Shakespeare's play. I think anyway. I don't know whether you would agree. There's much more of a sense, and this is what some kind of earlier critics took the play to task for, that it's just kind of bad luck that things don't turn out all right, for that the letter doesn't get delivered, that Mercutio is in the wrong place at the wrong time when Tybalt shows up looking for Romeo, these sorts of things. And so it's so in that respect, Romeo and Juliet looks less tragic until you get to the body count at the end, I would say.
Mm. Yeah, that's so interesting. The idea that it could have gone differently, or that sometimes people, this is a tragedy that misses being a comedy by, 30 seconds or whatever. Yeah. I remember when we were all looking in during the pandemic for what did Shakespeare do in the plague kind of things. I can remember someone saying perhaps Romeo and Juliet are the only victims of plague in Shakespeare's work, since that it's because the plague interrupts the letter delivery, isn't it?
Yes,
Um,
I dramaturged on a production of Romeo and Juliet a few years ago, and they judiciously changed those details of plague to being a COVID-19.
okay,
They
absolutely.
contemporize it, yes.
Yes, yes. Although sort of deliveries were about the only thing that did happen in COVID-19 in
Well,
certain ways. Yeah, you wouldn't have been able to get married, but you might have been able to get the letter. Um, uh, yeah, I mean, I think that sense that Shakespeare is most familiar with comedy as a genre and as a way of constructing a play world really revelatory, actually, about Romeo and Juliet, and the ways that it teases us with the idea that perhaps it could turn out right, or perhaps it could turn out differently. And it feels to me there's quite a long stage history of trying to play with the ending, or trying to make it different. I think there was a restoration version which was a comedy some nights, wasn't it? Or maybe that's an urban myth that I've
no,
never
well,
known
I
about
don't.
it.
Yeah, no, I think it's yeah. It was
Yeah.
performed on alternate nights as a comedy and a tragedy. And yeah, so it looked more like a tragic comedy when it had a happy ending.
hmm hmm Yeah, that's really interesting. Okay, so the sources are more, at least framed in a more moralizing way. That seems a helpful, more general point, actually, about Shakespeare tending to take out explicit moralizing, or to make that sort of more complicated or more shades of grey rather than clearly. It's a slightly anti-Catholic version, isn't it? I was thinking about it's the friar. Is that part of Brooks'
Yes,
feeling
very
about the
much
story?
so.
Yeah,
Very much
yeah,
so. Yeah.
yeah. Let me just go through. So we began by talking about how this might have looked when it was new, and about sort of trying to defamiliarize a play that, as we've already said, perhaps feels a little bit well worn. Um, is it? It's called Conceited, isn't it? I think in one of the early. Um, that's the adjective attached to it. So that's a about verbal ornament or something. Do you feel that it was you touched on the sort of linguistic um fireworks in a way of the play or the its particular use of language at least. Do you think that was its part of how it landed in the mid 1590s?
Oh, I think we can definitively say that it was, in part because we've got such strong evidence of readers. So this play was published for the first time shortly after it was first performed. It was published first in quarto in 1597, so within a year or two of its first performances. Published again a couple of years later, published successively over the course of the pre-Restoration period, and 5 quartos plus the appearance of the play in both the folios. And so readers liked this play, and it says on the title page of the first quarto that it's been, it's also been publicly played to great applause, so we know that audiences also liked it, but readers in particular liked it precisely for that language, and so in surviving copies of the play we can see that people are picking out those lines that give us those kind of conceits. They are fixating, for instance, on the two scenes in which Romeo and Juliet, the balcony scene and the scene as Romeo is leaving on his way to Mantua after spending the night in Juliet's bedroom, and that very kind of elevated, loving language between them. Readers are picking that out. These sort of heightened metaphors, often we think to then reuse in their own speech, perhaps their own courtship letters. There's a satire by John Marston from towards the end of the decade where he talks about this chap who's got a commonplace book made out of plays that he's drawing on for whenever he needs to court or rail or jest, and then when this chap starts speaking, and he says, I set his lips, sets his lips a brooch, and what comes out is nothing but pure Juliet and Romeo. And so the text of this particular play is being picked up on and recycled, partly because it presents itself up as kind of detachable bits, I think. That's part of what I find interesting about thinking about the play's language is, while it's very much it can seem very organic when you sit down and read the play as a whole, partly because it's things like the sonnets and the sonnet fragments throughout it, which we can talk about in a minute, help to obviously underpin this theme of love, which is kind of the overarching theme of the play. But just taken out of context, they can serve all sorts of purposes. And we know that they were frequently taken out of context, not just by readers who are copying them into their own manuscript commonplace books or marking lines in the margin, but also by people who are producing ready-made printed commonplace books who are going to plays by contemporary playwrights, and including Romeo and Juliet, and taking various lines and phrases and reorganizing them under kind of thematic headings such as virtue and beauty and love and things like that, so that they have then nothing to do with the context that they were originally written for. And so there's sort of two ways then that the play is popular. It's popular as an organic whole, but it's also popular as a kind of ready-made receptacle of excellent language that readers could draw inspiration from for their own compositions.
Yeah, it's really brilliant to be reminded of that, that actually part of the imagination and the encounter of early readers with Shakespeare or with their reading more generally was an instinct to cherry pick, was
Yeah.
not necessarily thinking about the whole thing, but thinking, oh, there's a good bit, and I can pull that out and strip away a couple of pronouns or something which fix it and put it in my commonplace book, and then it can be reused. Yeah, it's a great thought. And as you were speaking, I was thinking of one of the example that um, the Oxford World's Classics, the Oxford Shakespeare, unusually has kept at the beginning of Act Two, where there's a sequence where Romeo uses almost the same language that's then used by the friar. Do you remember? I've actually just got it here. The grey-eyed morn smiles on the frowning night, checkering the eastern clouds with streaks of light, and darkness freckled like a drunkard reels from fourth day's pathway made by Titan's wheels. So that's the end of Act Two, Scene One, and then so that's Romeo, and then in comes Friar Lawrence at the beginning of Act Two, Scene Two. The grey-eyed morn smiles on the frowning night, checkering the eastern clouds with streaks of light, and flecked darkness like a drunkard reels from fourth day's path and Titan's fiery wheels. So it's almost exactly the same speech, and I think most people, most editors have chosen to delete one of them as if this was a crossing out that didn't quite happen. It doesn't seem very realistic, as it were, that these two men would say exactly the same thing, one to end a scene and one to begin it. But it also does suggest that maybe Shakespeare writes a great killer speech or a lovely metaphor or a lovely simile or something, and only then thinks, well, who's going to give it? Rather than an
Yeah.
idea of thinking, what's the motivation of the friar? What was his childhood like? What kind of thing would he say? Which is more the kind of method way that an actor might sort of think about these
Mm,
characters.
Yes, and that's of course only one of sort of several very heightenedly poetic descriptions of dawn in the play, and you feel almost as though Shakespeare could have been working them up and then finding a place to insert them, right?
Mm, mm, mm. Let's think a little bit about what you would see as the themes of the play or the recurring kind of motifs of the play. What would you want to draw out from in that under
Well, I
that
think
heading?
is this a good time to think about the way that the prologue introduces these
That's a
themes?
really good idea. Why don't we do that? I'll just get the I'm just going to share my screen. Repeated webinar attendees will remember that this is always harder for me than it should be still. Um, no, that's not it. Oh, that is it. Is that it?
I mean, that is your screen, Emma. Whether it has any text on it, I'm not sure.
Oh, okay. Does that not have any text on it? Does that
Not
have
for
text on
me.
it?
Not for me.
Could anybody else just put in the question whether it does? It's very zoomed in. Okay. Does that mean small, Phoebe? No. Okay. That's fine. We can easily sort that out. I'm just going to stop sharing. And what I'm going to do instead is to go and find a copy of this. In fact, I'm going to find it from um, this. Okay, so let us let's look here. Okay, so
There we go.
let's look here instead. So we've got the Folger text, which is a very fine text, not quite as fine as our own, but very fine indeed. And this was the bit that Hannah wanted to see. Can everybody see this now? It's just showing my bookmarks. Okay.
Oh, are you sure? I can
How's that going
definitely,
now?
yeah, I can
Yes,
definitely.
yes, yes. Okay, there's quite a lot of yeses, so I think we're going to go with that. I'm sorry if you can't see it. We're just looking at the Romeo and Juliet prologue, so you could Google that very easily if you can't see it. And my apologies for technical incompetence. Hannah, over to you.
Yeah, so
This is what you wanted to pick out.
Yeah, I mean, and I think again, this is an example of a bit of Romeo and Juliet that people know, right? I think we're all quite well, if we're familiar with the play, we're familiar with the prologue, and but again, one of the things that I think it's interesting to do is to look at how carefully in this prologue Shakespeare sets up both the kind of thematic concerns of the play, but also the kind of linguistic formal concerns, the structure that he's going to use. So what I love about this is it's kind of like one of those trailers for a film where they tell you everything, they show you
Mm.
everything that's going to, so it's full of spoilers. I mean, we know how the play is going to end by the time we've got to the end of this speech right at the start of the play, but it also tells you precisely those themes that you asked about before, Emma, and they're presented as kind of pairs of opposites, right? We've got love and death. Okay, this death marked love. We've got death and life, love and strife. You might want to oppose as opposed to love and death. Parents and children, which I think contains within it another opposition of uh, age and youth. We've got, and you can see things come in pairs, and that idea is introduced right at the start with that word two, right? Two households, both alike in dignity, and we get the idea of twos and pairs repeated throughout the speech, and so now going to blank on his name, which is terribly disrespectful, but there's a critic who's talked about the binary logic of the play, and we see very much the opposition as the play goes on between sort of scenes that take place in day and scenes that take place in night. We see the private as opposed to the public. We see there's a sort of proliferation of binary oppositions that the chorus in this speech introduces, and so I think it's interesting to think not just about love being the overarching the overarching theme introduced here by the prologue, but also obviously strife is a very violent play, and the idea that this is a play that has where what happens has kind of civil repercussions. It's not
Mm.
just about Romeo and Juliet, this play. It's about, and coming back to this idea of tragedy. What is tragedy? Tragedy is not typically, in terms of conceptions of the genre at the time, something that impacts a community as opposed to, say, a royal household. But here it's very clear that this is this is a play that's going to have civil concerns, and also that young love, which again prior to now hadn't typically been the topic of tragedy, is going to be the main focus. And but then the other thing in terms of setting up not just kind of themes, but linguistic structures, is what do we notice about this? This is a sonnet. The play begins with this poetic form that is the kind of package, if you will, at the time of that theme of love. And it's the first of several sonnets and sonnet fragments throughout the play. The play will also end with a sonnet fragment with Aeschylus's final kind of pronouncements on the events that have just taken place. And so both in terms of what it says, but also how it says it, it introduces that idea of love. And I think it's quite clever in that respect.
Mm. It's really clever, and just sitting with it now is making me see, you could develop what you've said has lots of sort of directions. You could develop even the rhyming as a kind of binary logic, and it makes me look again at what's a very famous phrase, often taken out completely out of context: the 2 hours traffic of our stage. It makes it seem much less that that is a documentary account of how long a play took, and much more that it's participating in a rhetoric of doubleness, duality, two-ness in this particular context. Yeah, that's I hadn't ever thought that quite so clearly before. That's really great. Yeah, so we've got a sonnet with a ending in a couplet. Can you say a bit more about that spoiler alertness? Because when we were talking before about comedy, um, I suppose I was thinking, maybe this is a play that looks as if it could go differently, it could work out differently. It just misses being a comedy, or maybe we work out when Mercutio, a figure we haven't yet mentioned, but when Mercutio is killed, maybe there's no way back, or there's a moment when it becomes tragic. But this would suggest it's tragic from the absolute get-go. This is death-marked love right from the start. It's misadventured, it's star-crossed, everything is against it.
Yeah, I think, and it's an interesting thing for modern productions to grapple with, right? Do they want to, in fact, cut this very famous initial speech, partly so that you avoid that overt spoiler, and then kind of let things just play out as though they could have played out differently? I
Mm,
think I mean, the challenge is, and I think personally that Shakespeare succeeds is, despite having told us that this is what the outcome is going to be, to make us think subsequently that it could still potentially be different, to sort of show enough moments of what another critic has called kind of comic hope, that we think, oh well, we know it's going to go badly, but maybe this time, maybe this time the letter will be
mm,
delivered on time, maybe it will all be okay.
mm,
And so to have that sense in the back of our minds that it's going to go badly, but to hope that maybe this time it won't.
mm.
And I've lost my train of thought there. Ask me another question.
No, I think that I was asking you about the sort of, yeah, the uh, i- inevitability, uh, which is part of tragedy, I suppose, which is part of this narrative when we see it set up by the prologue, versus, other forms of sort of comic um, potential, comic narrative potential. But yeah, that was really, really interesting. I love that, the sense that we I suppose I've tended to focus on the prologue as a plot, about plot. That's probably my weakness in a way. Whereas you've focused on it as a kind of tuning in to the play's particular language, and the kind of forms in which it's going to proceed by these sort of paradoxes or opposites or pairs, not just Romeo and Juliet or Montague and Capulet, or but more generally, sort of speed and reflection, or hot and cold and all that stuff. Yeah, that's really fascinating. Can we say a bit more about? I loved you saying that young love had not really been a subject for a tragic play. Um, are there ways we tend to emphasize this as a timeless play, or it tends to keep being, there's always a Romeo and Juliet in, any divided community, aren't there? It's an available story somehow that keeps being replayed and replayed across the world. But were there ways that it was more immediate, do you think, more socially contextualized or more historically specific at the time?
Yeah, I think in a couple of ways that are worth remarking on. One is to think about the way that Romeo and Juliet fall in love, and that is obviously they fall in love at first sight, and the idea of falling in love at first sight had become a cliche even by this point, and Shakespeare has great fun with it in A Midsummer Night's Dream, which he's writing at the same time. But but they fall in love. The way that the falling in love at first sight is described harks back to what was understood at the time as quite a kind of defined physiological process, whereby when you looked at your lover to be, and a spirit left your eyes and ended up in embedding itself in them near their heart, which then began this process of making the lovers more alike to one another, to taking on this kind of mutuality of being, that then fed into the rhetoric at the time of kind of two becoming one, long before the Spice Girls got on board with this. This was very kind of big in Neoplatonic thought at the time, the idea that there would be this union of equals, and coming together as a pair of lovers would sort of destroy that individuation that had previously existed. And we can see this happening with Romeo and Juliet, and particularly in terms of the language of likeness that is used. There's another kind of prologue, chorus sonnet that is often cut at the start of Act 2, where the chorus says that now the lovers are alike bewitched by their looks, by kind of, obviously they've got good looks, they appreciate each other's attractiveness, but also they've literally looked at one another, and this has caused them to become bewitched in love, and therefore to become more alike one another, which they do over the course of the play. Romeo seems to become sort of slightly more effeminate at various points, taking on kind of Juliet's gender attributes. Juliet has these long, kind of quite robust soliloquies that are more associated with masculine speakers in Shakespeare's canon, and similarly they begin to share each other's language patterns. They obviously have this shared sonnet when they meet. The Good Pilgrim exchange of lines is, if you haven't noticed it before, is a shared set of 14 lines, where the couplet culminates in this kiss. It's one of the most kind of beautifully constructed bits of Shakespearean dialogue in that respect, in my opinion. But then Romeo rather also then kind of abandons this quite contrived poetic language that he has been using in his Rosaline phase, where he's very fixated on quite kind of cliched oxymorons and poetic conceits that are a bit humdrum, and moves towards much more sort of robust poetic language of the type that Juliet herself is using in those long soliloquies. And so that's one respect. Your initial question was about how the
It was
love
about,
related.
yeah, no, it was about a sort of, it's about, I suppose it was about whether there are ways of thinking about the play historically, which might have resonated in, things that we might now have lost.
That's
Yeah.
right, and that was the second thing I wanted to say, was that setting aside all of that kind of physiological aspect of falling in love, there's also the thing that when we think about sort of productions that want to kind of glamorize the relationship between Romeo and Juliet and hold it up as this kind of great couple, one thing that is worth remembering is that even though there's no kind of moralizing epistle in the way that there is for Brooke, for Shakespeare's play, is that it might not have landed in such a kind of favourable way for all audience members in the 1590s in terms of their judgment of Romeo and Juliet, because they are impetuous and they do, as I said earlier, kind of disregard the kind of normal social rituals of union and marriage. And one of the other things is that Juliet is very young. She's only 13 in the play. She's much younger than the Juliets in any of the previous source texts. Brooke's Juliet is 16, and it was very, very unusual for even young aristocratic women to be married and to consummate their marriages that early. In Shakespeare's England, be much more likely to be sort of pushing closer to 20, even if you were married, at the age that Juliet is married. The consummation of the marriage might not happen until later. And so there is something about that decision to make her so young, and to then kind of make them so fixated on on sex. On Romeo's desperate to make sure not only that they get married, but also that the nurse brings these cords that he's going to use to climb up to her bedroom window that night of the wedding, so that they can consummate the marriage immediately. That might have landed a bit differently in terms of thinking about the behaviour of these young people.
Mm. Yes, that's interesting to think. I mean, it would be hard to have a. I was going to say it'd be hard to have a version of Romeo and Juliet where you entirely sympathised with the parents, but there's not. It's almost as if Capulet gets, as if Shakespeare makes Capulet get harsher and harsher through the play. I don't know, maybe because his initial position is relatively reasonable. He does not
I
seem
see
a
him
bad
as
guy at the start.
Yeah, I see him as sort of just quite unpredictable in terms of his character. He
Mm,
sort of vacillates
mm.
between, because
Yeah,
initially
you're
he's
too
really
young to marry, and now you're going to marry, and yeah.
exactly. And then, but and he comes across, obviously, he kind of joins the fight in Act One, Scene One. But then, when he thinks that Juliet is going to marry Paris, it's sort of quite endearing in the way that he then goes to chat with the servants about what the wedding party is going to look like, and
Mm,
he's terribly excited and playing the housewife. And he just doesn't. He's an inconsistent parent, is how
mm,
I would describe him.
mm.
And no, I don't see. I think the play, again, thinking about that opposition of parents and children and youth and age, I think that the play doesn't really set us up to either judge or sympathise with either end of that spectrum. I
That
think.
that's so interesting. That's an unexpected, but I think you're absolutely right. That's a really unexpected reply. I was just thinking that the one of the bits I really tiny details I really like in the at the party, the party where Romeo and friends sort of gate crash and he meets Juliet for the first time. At that party, there's a scene where the little sort of exchange where they're looking at somebody, Capulet and somebody, they're looking at a sort of lad on the stage and saying, "Who is that?" And they say, "Oh, it's young so and so." And Capulet says, "Well, it can't be him because he's only a child," and it's so that just feels like a sort of conversation at anybody's sort of family gathering to say, but that can't be because that's just a child. But it's a tiny realist thing about young people growing up too fast, I suppose, and a kind of gap between them as sort of nascent adults or adolescents. And yeah, but you're so interesting about Juliet. It's one of the ways the play has encountered a difficulty, hasn't it, in modern performance, that the actors of the age that Juliet is in the play are, cannot possibly be cast
No,
in
no.
this drama anymore. I mean, it is not appropriate in any sense.
Yeah, and those lines that refer to her age, and there are several of them in the play. Like it really,
Mm.
it's made clear that she is that young. All of those lines have to be cut or fudged some way
Yeah,
in modern productions, and it is again, it's one of those moments where it's worth kind of sitting with the text
yeah,
as it is to think about how we might respond to it differently if we sort of took seriously the proposition that this was a 13-year-old girl
yes,
wanting to kind of throw herself into the arms of someone she'd only known for less than 24
yeah.
hours.
I can't remember now the detail of it, but there's only, like a handful of characters in Shakespeare across all of Shakespeare where we know their age.
Mm,
It's really not a standard way of
yeah.
depicting them at all. So it's more and more strange. Hannah, this is just it's so interesting. I think what I'm going to do is open up some questions, and I'm going to come back to you at the end for us to finish up. Um, we've got lots of different questions and some great comments. There's two that I think probably we might take together. Um, Edel, it's great to see you. Is saying about the play that we've sort of touched on this, but maybe there's a bit more we can do. The play is so familiar now. I found the tragedy and impulsive teens get little sympathy from my students. Is there anything after you've spent so much time with the play that was new and unfamiliar, or how do we defamiliarize for a contemporary savvy or even cynical audience.
Mm, mm.
As you've been working on this play and you'll be much more considered. I was thinking whether Mercutio is a character who modern performances have often found to be a kind of route into a commentator figure and a kind of a likable or an attractive figure who gives us a different perspective, isn't within this mooning world of the lovers, and perhaps is a more modern figure. I don't know. What would you how would you answer that?
Yeah, I think I did spend a bit of time thinking about the way that Mercutio possibly let, you know, as you say, is the way into these more kind of presentist readings of the play, of how can the play resonate for us today. And one of those, Mercutio is often now, I think, in contemporary productions, played as a queer character, and sometimes kind of harboring an unrequited passion for Romeo. I think more recently in that 2021 National Theatre production that was supposed to be a play but ended up being kind of filmed in the theatre. It's quite a lovely production, that one.
Mm,
There's a sort of there's something going on between Mercutio and Folio, and I think then to sort of to focus the spotlight on Mercutio and say, look, here's a character who kind of presents other, perhaps more commonsensical ways of thinking about love for contemporary teenagers, who is quite anti-romantic. He's not necessarily anti-sex, but he's definitely anti the type of mooning that Romeo is doing, and the type of kind of self-involved poeticizing that is taking up too much of his time.
mm,
He's also I mean, thinking about him alongside Benvolio, in fact, as a couple of characters who just say, look, there are other options, there are other options other than this kind of path towards kind of romantic
mm,
a fixation on marriage and monogamy, and Benvolio, when Romeo is mooning over Rosaline, says, look, examine other beauties. He's like, don't even kind of think that there might be one other woman out there for you who's not Rosaline. There are loads of them.
mm,
And so kind of pushing back against thinking about those supporting characters as offering alternatives, and if we want to come back to the idea of framing the play in some sense as a moral lesson, the fact that those characters don't get listened to, and Romeo and Juliet do
mm,
ignore that type of advice, and just end up dead.
mm,
There's something interesting to think about there for a contemporary audience, I think.
mm. But related to that, maybe I might take Brianna's question, which is about a sort of queer coding of the play, or
Mm.
uh, what we might want to say about that. They say about a transitioning. Sorry, Brianna, I'm looking. Just saw it as I scrolled through, and now, oh yeah, here we are. Um, Romeo's transitioning between female male characteristics throughout the play, which is actually quite an interesting sense that some gender norms are being um, differently deployed at different times, maybe.
Sorry, what is the question, Emma?
Because it isn't really a question. I marmalized the question. Brianna did ask a question, which could it be queer coded? Does it seem queer coded to you? Are there ways that Romeo sort of transitions across genders, possibly?
Yeah, I think so. I think I sort of touched on that slightly in
Yeah.
terms of thinking about how Romeo and Juliet take on each other's gender attributes. So it's not just Romeo who, as who's sort of explicitly described and self-describes as having become kind of effeminized through his contact with
Mm.
Juliet. It's also Juliet taking on some of these more masculinized roles. She delivers this prothalamium, this speech that gallop apace you fiery-footed steeds, that lovely speech where she's anticipating her wedding night. This is critics have seen this as the type of speech that was the type of verse form that was typically delivered on the occasion of a wedding by a male speaker, and here Juliet's delivering it herself. And she also takes on some of those kind of typically masculinist possessive traits. I mean, in the very last line of the play, it's not Romeo and his Juliet, it's Juliet and her Romeo, whereas kind of in the patriarchal conception of marriage at the time, it would be the husband who possessed the wife. So I do think that type of gender blurring could certainly lend itself these days to a queer coding.
That's great. There's a couple of questions that are a bit more about Juliet. Josie remembers our dear tutor in Shakespeare and Catherine Duncan-Jones saying that Juliet lives an entire life during the play, conveyed through the evolving maturity and complexity of her diction. And she wonders if this is true of Romeo as well. That's interesting about whether the characters develop. Um, but then there's a couple of questions which might be related to this, which are comparing the play with a later Jacobean tragedy with uh, Duchess of Malfi.
Mm.
Could you call Webster's play The Duchess of Malfi a spiritual successor to Romeo and Juliet? And then again, a question about uh, somebody's obviously interested in space in the Duchess of Malfi. I hadn't seen that connection myself. Well, the connection that's sometimes made with later Jacobean tragedy is with Ford's play "'Tis Pity She's a Whore," which is a play about a brother sister incest, with a friar looking on and giving a kind of cover for it in a way, and which also literalizes these Petrarchan tropes of extreme passionate love in very sort of violent ways. So I'd thought of that connection, but I hadn't thought of the Duchess of Malfi one. But I suppose it like Josie's question focuses on Juliet,
Mm.
because nobody cares about the Duchess of Malfi's husband, either of
Yes,
them. Mm.
yes, and a woman obviously very clearly asserting her own desire. I think one thing there that is interesting to think about, perhaps, and we haven't spoken of this much, is the difference between the two early quartos of Romeo and Juliet and the way that Juliet appears differently in them. So, I mean, all sorts of ideas about what we don't have time to get into necessarily the reasons for this initial text of the play that is around 700 lines shorter than the text that we're most familiar with, the one that's reprinted in the Oxford World's Classics, and that's produced in the Oxford World's Classics edition that we're talking about. But certainly in that shorter Q1 text, Juliet's long speeches that give us so much of her kind of philosophizing and interiority are radically shorter, and that makes the character appear to have less of that kind of agency and self-determination than the longer version presents us with, and certainly that I think would align her more closely with the Duchess, or possibly I don't know whether I have read the play sufficiently recently to say this, but maybe with Beatrice, Joanna, and the Changeling as well.
Okay, interesting.
And yeah, but I think do we sympathise with Juliet more because of her youth? I don't know.
Hmm. Yeah, and Tina asks if is there more if is there more interiority from Juliet than Romeo, and that's also sort of related there. Yeah, thanks for those questions. That's all really interesting. I might just pick up while you've just been talking about the different texts of the play. Now, Roger asks how closely the edited version aims to present Shakespeare's original language and intention. And that's a helpful question to ask, Roger. So the new Oxford Shakespeare that we are working with is absolutely Shakespeare's original language. The spelling is modernized, and the punctuation is modernized, and expert editors have made their judgment about when maybe additional stage directions might be needed, or whatever. But this is not an adaptation or a modernized version of the play, or a translate, any of those things. It's as we understand the texts have come down to us from early witnesses. Now, Shakespeare's intentions, which I'm avoiding using because we really sort of don't know what they are or were, and we also don't really know why plays. Well, we probably do know why plays exist in different early exemplars that Hannah's just been talking about. A longer and a shorter version of Romeo and Juliet probably represent the play for different performance moments, or um, different performance possibilities. Just as if you were to read, I don't know, just thinking about, say, Tom Stoppard, who's in our minds because of his recent death, or another modern playwright, that often there are different editions of a play by them which relate to different revivals, or different moments when it was performed. So I think that the different texts are probably largely theatrical in origin, but other people might say that they're more literary, or whatever. But just to reassure Roger that I think this is an edition which is very committed to the original texts and to how we can recover those, as well as we can. Chloe's asked about Friar Lawrence. She finds him interesting and tricky. What do you think about Friar Lawrence? There's that moment at the end of the play, isn't it, where the prince says, some shall be pardoned and some punished, and you wonder who will be punished. Will it be Friar
Yes,
Lawrence?
although he also says we still have known thee for a holy man, which seems to be a bit of a pass for him.
Mm,
He's one of those characters that I think we perhaps miss the complexity of in modern productions, because he has that long speech in the final scene where he sort of explains how he intended everything to turn out different. He kind of takes ownership of the fact that everything's gone wrong, and says, "Oh, I did try and deliver the letter," and that speech is often cut. Either productions will just end the play after Juliet's suicide, and we won't have that kind of mop up with the prince and the friar and the parents. Or if we do have that, certainly that long speech of Friar Lawrence's is truncated or cut, and that perhaps does remove some of his. It almost makes him feel a little bit craven, that speech, to me. He's confronted with the parents of these young people who have died in part because of his machinations, and also with this figure of authority in Princess Bliss, who could reprimand him in some way, and so and that comes across, that sense of potential consequences for him comes across in that speech, and he's very much seemed in control. It gives him more of a character arc if you keep that speech in,
mm,
because he gives a sense of someone who is in control, and as though he is kind of masterminding this kind of coming together of the Montagues and the Capulets through marrying
mm,
Romeo and Juliet, and then it all goes terribly wrong. And of course, that coming together of the Montagues and the Capulets does occur at the end of the play, because they're so shaken by their children's death that they decide to get rid of, to end the feud. But so yes, I think he's a character that suffers from modern cuts somewhat.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I was just thinking that our first webinar of 2026 will be Measure for Measure, where another Juliet gets sort of counsel from a friar. They're really interesting figures, aren't they? They come from the sources largely, and they come from European sources, often Catholic. And there's a strange way in which they retain some of their holiness, but they also are drained of it. There's an odd way in which that translation happens. Mark asks about anti-Catholicism, and I don't think the play. My sense is this play isn't anti-Catholic. Brooks' poem that it's based on begins at least by saying, this is about children who disobey their parents and they take counsel instead from friars and gossips.
And
But
it's
that's
very
not.
big on the sin of auricular confession. It doesn't like the
Oh
idea
yes,
that there's kind of
auricular
like
confession.
secrecy to do with
Yeah.
the practice of
And
Catholicism.
that's so interesting. I'm thinking back to the question we had about Duchess of Malfi now, which I'm going to obviously create an absolutely perfect answer to that question in about 3 days' time when nobody else cares. Um, but that's interesting, isn't it? There's the sort of Catholic sense there about her going on, saying she's going to go on pilgrimage and so on. That's also interesting, really interesting. A nice Christopher Carr says, "How would you address a massive literature from Oxfordians and Marlovians and others that William Shakespeare had no access to detailed Italian geography and language sources?" I would address it by saying, Christopher, that I don't think Shakespeare shows any particular detailed knowledge of Italian geography, or any knowledge of Italian language. As Hannah's explained, Arthur Brooks' Romeo and Juliet is a translated poem published in London in English. Shakespeare knows diddly squat, I think, about Italian geography, and that's evident in quite a lot of his plays. So that doesn't seem to me a particularly that doesn't seem to be a particularly strong claim. I think if the Oxfordians and Marlovians asked, how did anybody write this stuff, that would be closer to the real mystery about Shakespeare, but it's not answered by saying it was the Earl of Oxford. It's still a mystery. Um, uh, Somebody's asked us to please explain the whole story in short paragraphs. I'm actually just going to pass on that and think that you could probably get that quite easily elsewhere, and that's not absolutely perfect. Um, oh God, Christopher, really, okay, you're on quite a lot about Marlowe. Interesting, really, really interesting. People can follow up with Christopher, I think, if they're interested about that. We're not going to explain the whole story in short paragraphs, but we perhaps will have a think finally about some adaptations. It's interesting. Sabine mentioned ballet adaptations, and I'm just wondering whether there's something about this play which seems particularly. Is it the story? Is there any way that linguistic texture that you talked about is being translated into other media? What do you think about the afterlife
Yeah,
of the play?
I think, um, I mean, I tend to think more that the linguistic texture, yeah, I think, as I said right at the outset, some of that language gets lost in the adaptations, and that seems to me a bit of a shame. But you're right that the most successful adaptations often find a way of substituting it. And without wanting to talk about ballet and other sort of more tangential adaptations, even just thinking about those two very successful 20th century films, which are Baz Luhrmann's Romeo and Juliet and Franco Zeffirelli's earlier one, they both find a way of taking that cut text and sort of reconfiguring it visually. I mean, Baz Luhrmann's got all of this this mise en scène, which is very reliant on the language of Shakespeare's, not just lost words from the text of Romeo and Juliet, when we see the guns that say rapier and
Mm,
longsword and things like that on them, but also billboards that say Globe Theatre, Pool Hall, and the Merchant of Verona Beach and things like
mm,
that. So he's finding a way to encode some of that language that has gone visually, which is what the most successful film adaptations have to do. And Zeffirelli kind of does that, I think, with the sumptuousness of the cinematography in his
mm,
adaptation. I don't think that version has, maybe pilloried for saying this, I personally don't think the Zeffirelli version has dated very well. I think that
mm,
the Luhrmann one actually does still hold up. I still show that to my students, and they respond to it well, even though it's coming up for 30 years old now.
mhm.
And uh, I'm rambling now, Emma. We're getting past our
No, I think yeah, I think the Zeffirelli sort of did invent a kind of youth culture, didn't it, for its moment, but I agree with you that it is not dated so well. There's loads of other questions. It's been a really exciting sort of question period and lots of different ways of coming at this play. Mark speaking for us all, Hannah making me feel ancient there. Those of us who still think Baz Luhrmann is the new thing. I'm going to finish by asking Hannah what she would suggest if people want to take this further. I do recommend, obviously, her introduction that we've been riffing on here for the Oxford World's Classics. Um, what else would you recommend, Hannah, to anybody who is on this call who thinks, yeah, I'd like to take seriously the idea that we need to look again at this play?
I think one thing I'd recommend that people do is read the Q1 version of the text. I think it's really interesting to think about that earlier printed version, which is so much shorter and might possibly represent what was performed on the Elizabethan stage. There's a good accessible edition by Lucas Erne for people who are more interested in that sort of textual difference between the two early versions of the text. If you are wanting just a really solid, sort of more expansive introduction to some of the ideas that we've talked about today, there's actually there's a sort of companion text to Romeo and Juliet written by Sasha Roberts almost 30 years ago now. It's a 1997 text, I think, but it's just in terms of engaging with some of the historical context that does cut through some of that old Romeo and Juliet as a text for all time rhetoric, that it's this universal love story. She's very good at showing how, in fact, historically bounded some of the ideas in the play are. I think that's just called Romeo and Juliet. It's published by Northcote House, and Sasha Roberts is very good on that. So, and then in terms of productions, I also really highly rate that 2021 National Theatre film production. Again, it's very brutally cut, but in a way that makes sense, and it's a lovely it's also a lovely kind of moment in time in terms of thinking back to the COVID-19 pandemic. As I say,
Mm.
it's filmed in the empty theatre on the South Bank, and there are lovely touches, such as when Romeo gets banished to Mantua, he goes down to a disused rehearsal room, and that's where he
Mm.
gets to hang out until it's time to come back. And so yeah, those are very basic kind of further avenues for exploration, but enjoyable one.
Brilliant. That's absolutely great. Claire Wakeham has reminded us about West Side Story, and Shabanka a while ago in the chat mentioned perhaps a more acceptable Marlovian version of this play, which was in Shakespeare in Love. If you've forgotten that bit, that's well worth a revisit. It's been really brilliant to talk to you, Hannah. Thank you so much for getting up so early in New Zealand and talking to us. Um, we have got a program of 10 webinars in 2026. They will continue to be live on the first Monday of each month. The 5th of January is the first, and if you want festive reading in advance, it is going to be measure for measure, measure for measure. So really look forward to seeing you next time, and thanks so much to Hannah.
Thanks, Emma.